What is up, YouTube? It's me, Euchre, back at it again with another TFT fundamentals video. Today we're going to talk about items in TFT. I'm going to go through the item system and how you can get different items in the game, and then I'm going to discuss how I go about slamming my items, using my items to get the most effectiveness out of my items and units within the game, to save as much HP as possible, and ultimately to place as well as possible. First, let's jump into how the item system works. This is going to be a little bit granular, a little bit complex, and it might be hard to understand, but it's important when we get later into thinking about what items you want to slam, what components you expect to drop later in the game. From the carousels and creep rounds, you'll end up getting 12 or 13 total item components by the end of 4-7. When I talk about an item component, that means like a sword, a belt, etc. There's a concept that I'm going to refer to as item pools. Think of it like a pond of item fish of sorts. This is where all the components are stored that will eventually drop through the creep rounds. Each pond with those components inside has 3 of each component. And then once you drop that item component from the creep rounds, it takes it out of the pool. It's like you cast a line in, hook one of those component fish, and it comes out on the creep round. But note that the carousel doesn't count towards these item pools. When you get it from the creep round, that's what people refer to as naturaling an item. It means that you've gotten one naturally from the creeps. This is important especially when you get into the mid and late game, because you'll have a guess of what items you might drop. If you haven't naturaled any tiers, but you have 10 item components already, well, at 4-7, you have a pretty high probability of dropping tiers, because say that you have a lot of swords and bows, well, your sword pool might already have 2 swords out of it, and your bow pool might already have 2 bows that you've naturaled from previous creep rounds. Well, that means that there's 3 tiers still in the pool, but there's only 1 sword and 1 bow. Think about these items in terms of weighing your probability for what items you might get, and you can try to optimize the items you take from carousel based on what items you might get in the future, or you're more likely to get in the future. This is probability that you can weigh, and it will impact the items that you have available to slam. Let's get into how I really use my items once I've acquired them, either from the creeps or from the carousel. The biggest point that's, I think, pretty basic is just use your items. I played some duo modes with friends where oftentimes we'll match up against silver, gold, platinum players, and something I notice a lot is that they'll have 8, sometimes 10 item components on their bench doing nothing. That costs you a lot of HP, and in double up sometimes it can work out. Maybe you get perfect items, you have a bigger health pool, but when you're playing normal ranked TFT or normal game TFT, that's just the normal 1 versus 1 versus 1 versus 1, and there's 8 total players, you really want to be using your items. If I have 3 items on my bench in my challenger games, I get nervous. I'm going to take 1,000,000 damage because all the other players are using their items in some shape or form to make items that will help improve their team's strength and ultimately kill more units, whether they're winning or losing, and give them a higher probability to win each fight. This is a lot like the concept that we talked about in the positioning video. I think especially when you're trying to win streak or trying to be strong in stage 2 and stage 3, using your items as quickly and efficiently as possible is going to serve you well and take you a long way. The other thing is, on most units, best in slot is something that people talk about, trying to get the best or the most optimal items on your carry. That can be important sometimes, maybe a little bit. I mean, you can optimize it, but it's not going to make that big of a difference. Like say that you have an Aurelia 2 carry. Aurelia probably does best with a Last Whisper, an IE, a BT, but you don't need those 3 specific items. If you have a Deathblade available early game and you're trying to play Aurelia eventually, you can go ahead and slam that Deathblade and it's going to do very well on the Aurelia. There's a lot of different examples of this, but especially in set 6.5, most carries I've found don't need a super particular set of items, and you can get away with a lot of different things. I think about a unit like Malzahar. Malzahar can use Morello very well, but he also uses AP pretty well. He can use blue buff or Shojin, or sometimes none at all if you have Synaptic Web. Usually items can be pretty versatile, and I like to just generally slam whatever items are available. So let's talk about how I determine which items to slam and when. There's 2 main factors that I think about when determining what items to slam and when. The first factor that I think about is how it affects my current board strength. If you have a strong unit, you usually want to be trying to build items that will enhance that strong unit's power. Say that you have a board of mostly 1 stars in stage 2 or stage 3, but you're playing a Sejuani 2 as your front line. Well, you probably want to build items that are going to buff up that Sejuani 2. Maybe you have a Bramble vest available, you have 2 chain vests, or you have a Sunfire cape, a chain and a belt. Or maybe you have 2 cloaks and you feel like you got Mort Dog, but you just slam a Dragon's Claw on that Sejuani because it's going to make her a lot stronger, help her deal some damage in the fight, and probably buff up your team. You could also build a Stone Plate or an Ionic Spark. A lot of different options are going to buff up your Sejuani, and the same thing could be said for backliners. But you do want to focus on, if you're slamming items early for board strength, picking out whatever your strongest units are, be that an AD carry, an ability power carry, an attack damage carry, an ability power carry, or a tank. You want to build items that are going to buff up that unit. Slamming items is especially important if you're on a win streak. If you've won 1 fight or 2 fights and that item slam might allow you to get a win streak and generate more gold, that's going to improve your chances of doing well in the game substantially. The other factor that I weigh when considering what items to slam is what potential units I could put those items on later. This is a little bit less important if you're slamming tank items or utility items, because most comps can use tank items and utility items effectively. But you want to be weighing what carry might use the items later. If you're building a Runin's Hurricane, that might go on a Draven or a Sivir, but it's not going to do as well if you're trying to play Ahri carry, because Ahri doesn't really benefit very much from attack damage and a bolt that spreads her attack damage. She wants AP items, maybe Blue Buff, Death Cap, or IE Jeweled Gauntlet. So you want to think about what carries you might be able to play based on the board state that you have right now, and slam items that are going to both fit with your board right now, as well as fit with the board that you want to reach in the future. So far I've talked a lot about slamming items, but when should you be reserved with your items? There are a few important scenarios in which I try not to slam items. One is if you have a really weak board stage 2, you might want to keep the items off of your units in order to try to 5-loss or 4-loss streak in stage 2 to generate that extra money. The other reason you might not want to slam items, if you have really weird items that don't necessarily build an item you would want to slam, and you want to have high pick priority for the carousel so that you can get the carry items you're going to need to come back into the game later, then you might want to not slam items to help you lose a little more HP and get a better pick priority in order to get the items that you're going to want to spike later on in the game and avoid bleeding out once you're at that stage 3, stage 4, stage 5 period in the game. I talked about best in slot not really existing, in my opinion, in this current patch, this current set. There are some best in slots out there, but I don't think it's extremely important for optimal gameplay. I think you can get away sometimes with scuffed items. I'll slam almost any item in stage 2. I'm going to go through here a list of items I usually try not to slam unless there's a really specific scenario to slam it. But other than these items, I pretty much will slam anything. The items I usually don't slam right now are Banshee's Claw, which I still call Trap Claw, Titan's Resolve, Spear of Shojin, QSS, Quicksilver, Giant Slayer, Archangel, and Gunblade. Those are items that I don't usually slam for one reason or another. QSS and Giant Slayer are examples of items that can be really powerful later in the game, but early game, they usually don't have that much power in stage 2, and you generally get a little bit better value from just greeting those items. At least in the early mid-game, you can get better value out of them. Shroud is one that is always a super good item, especially if you're landing it, but sometimes it can be a little bit taxing, especially in stage 2 and stage 3, to be really hard sweating it, and you lose a glove, which can be a very valuable carry component. So those are items that I usually don't slam. But you'll notice that I think I've said about 6-7 items, and pretty much all the other items, and I don't know the exact number, but there's a lot of items out there, and I'll pretty much build any of them in the right scenario. Some items that I think are pretty situational is something like Locket. If you have a lot of tanks on your board, I try not to build Locket, but if my board is a lot of squishy units that deal damage, but benefit from having a little bit more of effective HP for the team, Locket's really, really valuable and can help you streak stage 2 in a lot of scenarios you might not otherwise be able to. The place where item pools can come in handy a lot is later in the game, when you're in stage 3 and stage 4, deciding which items to slam, knowing which items you've taken from carousel versus which items you've naturaled can be really, really important to determining what to slam. The other thing that I consider heavily, especially in the mid game, when I'm deciding whether to slam items, is what I'm going to be able to do with that component. in the future. Essentially, what I'm trying to evaluate in that scenario is how many rounds that component is going to stay on my bench versus what it could do for me in, say that it's going to be dormant on my bench for 4 or 5 rounds if I don't just slam something now and I'd wait to try to greed the items. Well, that's 4 or 5 rounds of HP. If I lose all 4 or 5 rounds of those, I'm going to be down 40 or 50 health probably. So let's say, for example, that I have a bow and a belt. They can make Zizira if you want to, but I'm playing, they can also make really valuable frontline items and attack speed items for carries. But if I'm playing Ahri, a champion who doesn't really use bow super well, I mean, you can build a giant slayer for her, but she doesn't really want to use bow, and she doesn't use belt at all. And I know that because I have a tier on my Ahri, the next item I want to take from Carousel is going to be a blue buff. It might make sense to just slam that Zizira because the effectiveness I get out of my items now is really significant, as Zizira does a lot in early mid-game fights, and I'm not going to be able to get any use out of that bow or belt for a long time anyway, because the next item that I'm going to be taking from Carousel isn't supposed to build into isn't supposed to be used with that bow or belt. Instead, I'm taking a tier to make a blue buff on my Ahri. So I might as well get some value out of that bow and belt rather than letting them sit on my bench and do nothing. I'm a big advocate of considering how many rounds you're going to have an item do nothing on your bench versus just building it. The same goes for if you're playing, say you're playing like Jhin and Orianna as 2 of your carries, or you're planning to eventually. If you have a tier and a cloak, but you're trying to complete your Jhin items, and so you know on Carousel you're going to take a bow or a sword or a glove if it's available, it might make sense to just build something with that tier and cloak. Maybe you build a chalice, which isn't that amazing for Jhin, but it's not the worst thing ever, and it's pretty good for Orianna and probably the 3rd unit that you have back there. Maybe you're running, I don't know, a Zyra, or you're running a Misfortune or a Caitlyn that can use a little bit of AP. It's not bad, and I might just build that chalice. You also get a tier on whoever's holding the chalice. Say that you slap that on your Orianna. She casts with 15 mana. She casts 15 mana quicker, and you're just getting some value out of items that otherwise would just sit on your bench and not really do anything for you. I think that's the core message of this video, is just think about how you can get the most effectiveness out of your items and make sure that your items are working for you rather than just taking up space on your bench. There's always something you can be getting out of your items, even if it's just a little bit of scrap value. Make sure that you're putting them on your units and getting the best out of your items. At the end of the day, really improving in TFT in my mind is about consistency, efficiency, and using all of your items takes you a long way towards the path of most efficient player. So keep this in mind in your next ladder game. Thanks so much for watching. I appreciate all the support on these fundamental videos, and please remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and you want to see more of it. Let me know down in the comments below what you liked about this video, what you think could be better, and what topic you want next.